Exodus chapter 3, reading from verses 1 to 15. Has everyone found that? Good. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you're standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So go, I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I, that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God said, I will be with you, and this will be a sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. Moses said to God, Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, The God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, What is his name? Then what shall I tell them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, Say to the Israelites, The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name by which I am to be remembered from generation to generation.
Okay, guys, if you have Exodus 3 open in your Bibles, this is where we're going to be at this morning. Okay, do you know what one of the hardest things was when I was going from secondary school to sixth form? It wasn't the workload, although some of you maybe in sixth form, you might know it is harder. It's not having to choose my own clothes after 5 years of being in uniform. I just picked a black t-shirt and jogging bottoms. It's a lot easier that way. And it wasn't that the sixth form centre was on the other side of the school site to my house, so it took 5 minutes longer to get there, which is hard, isn't it? You're trying to factor that in, getting up in the morning. But you could just miss form period. Don't miss form period. That's really bad, but you could. The hardest thing for me was having to call my teachers by their first name. Because since reception class, we've had it drummed into us that teachers were called Sir or Miss. Even if they're married, they're Miss, right? Sir or Miss. They were Mr. Smith. They were Miss Brown, Mrs. Jones, and occasionally Ms. Taylor. But the September after we'd finished year 11, so after 6 weeks, it's not very long, is it? 6 weeks of summer holiday, we returned to school, and the same teachers that we had, some of them for years, suddenly expected us to call them by their first names. To this day, if I meet them in town or whatever, because I still live near where I went to school, I find it hard to do. And I'm a grown man now. Being on first name terms with someone suggests a level of intimacy. especially in a formal culture like a school. Old people like me and others who are older than me get peeved when a cold caller rings you and they address you by your first name. It's really annoying. It's like, what gives you the right to waste my time ringing me up and then talking to me as if we're friends when you're trying to sell me something I don't want? It's not like I answer most of the time. You know, like, I don't recognize that number. I'm not answering that. But if I do, because I think maybe it's a mobile number or whatever, they haven't earned the right to call me by my first name. They don't know me. It's disrespectful. Well, in today's reading, I wonder if you noticed that we just saw God, the Elohim, that we met yesterday, introduce himself to Moses with his first name. Yahweh, like we were singing. It's with his personal name. And he does it in such a way, it makes it really clear in our reading that this name, Yahweh, is meant to be used. This is my name forever, the name you shall call me. You shall call me from generation to generation. So we're going to look at 7 different perspectives. I had 2 points yesterday. I've got 7 this morning. Yeah. How long are we going to be here? We've got 7 different perspectives on this name to help us understand just what this name means. And to make it a little bit easier, because we've got 7 of them, they all begin with P. Okay? 7 P words. No one laughed at that. I'm really impressed. Well done, guys. So perspective number 1 is proviso or proviso. I don't know how you meant to say that word. I should have picked a different word, but caveat begins with C, so that's no good. It's a proviso. The proviso is that we're not altogether sure how to pronounce this name that we've just all sung together. Now, here's the reason why. You're going to get some more Hebrew today. Hebrew is what you call a consonantal language. That means it's made of consonants only. It doesn't have vowels when it's written down. The vowels, they're called diacritic marks. Check me out. Those were added in later to Hebrew language Bibles. Before, it was just all consonants. You're probably too young to remember this, but those of us who had phones in the days before smartphones, you were really limited on the number of characters you could put in text. And so getting a text from your mum, it was just impenetrable because there were just no vowels in it whatsoever. You were trying to work out what they were saying by adding vowels in it. Like, and Hebrew's a bit like that. They knew which vowels to put in because they read the Bible so much, but they didn't put them in the language. So this name, Yahweh, in Hebrew is 4 letters. YHWH. That's how we translate it. YHWH. If you want another good long word to impress your friends back at church or wherever, it's called a tetragrammaton. I mean, Ben could have had points for that, but leaders don't get points, so tough. Tetragrammaton sounds really cool. It sounds like something from a sci-fi film. In fact, I know of one sci-fi film, what it's in. But it just means 4 letters. Because that's what the name's... It's 4 letters. The name is 4 letters long. That's what it's called. Now, Yahweh seems like the most likely way to say it, based on the most recent scholarship and what seems to make sense and the way Hebrew works. But the fact is, and it's really interesting, its proper pronunciation, despite Moses having been told, the name you shall call me forever from generation to generation, the proper pronunciation's been lost. Now, the reason for that is because a long time ago, Jewish people had such a high view of this name. They thought this is the name of God. This is a holy name. This is a special name. There was such a high name of it, a high view of it, that they stopped speaking it out loud altogether. Some of us who looked at the 3rd commandment a little later on in Exodus on Saturday night, we thought about this. They were so afraid that they might accidentally misuse the name. They might accidentally blaspheme, that they just stopped saying it. They're like, I'm not even going to read it when it's in the Bible. It was too high, too precious, too sacred. So when they were reading the Bible out loud, which they did every Saturday in synagogue, or before that when they met at the temple, they would read the Bible out loud and they would come to this name, and it's used over 6,000 times in the Old Testament. That's quite a lot, isn't it? I mean, you read most bits of the Bible, you can't avoid it. It's there 6,000 times. And so instead of saying it out loud, they would say Adonai, which is the word for Lord. It means Lord. And that's the reason that in most of our Bibles, when it's translated as Lord, but all in capitals. 4 letters in English to represent the 4 letters in Hebrew that means Lord. Now, to make this easier for readers in Hebrew, when they started putting the vowels in, when it was like you've got a smartphone and you've got WhatsApp and stuff, so you don't actually need to like worry about you've got Wi-Fi or whatever, so you can put the vowels in, and they put the vowels in to make it easier to read and to make it easier to remember when you're reading this out loud. You're not meant to say it. If you write it out, they might say it. So what they did was they put extra vowels in, the vowels from the word Adonai, sort of in between the spaces, so that they'd remember when they came to it. It's like, well, that's a weird word. It means I'm supposed to say Adonai. So I'll say Adonai instead of that name I'm not supposed to say out loud. So in Greek versions of scriptures, you see how this is quite a long track, isn't it, for a first point. This gives a word, when they translated it from Hebrew to Greek, that sounds something or looks something like Jehovah. It's all vowels. It's a bit of a mess. It sounds something like Jehovah. So when English people started translating the Greek Bible into English, that's what they thought the name was, because they sadly often weren't on very good terms with Jewish people, and they couldn't just ask them, this word, what's going on with this? And they just thought, oh, that's a word, let's put it, and there we get the word Jehovah. So that's why we're a bit confused about it. That's our first perspective. Just it's a proviso. Someone tell me how that is afterwards. Just so we know the story behind that. Okay. So secondly, perspective number 2, which is kind of our first perspective, is permanence. So look at verses 13 and 14. Permanence. When Moses asks God's name, God replies by saying something like, I am who I am, or maybe you've got a footnote in your Bible, I will be what I will be. I am who I am. Now in Hebrew, get some more Hebrew today, I am is something like ayeh. Sounds like ayeh. So when God declares his name to be Yahweh, it links back to his statement, I am who I am. It's like a play on words. Now this was so obvious to Jewish people that the phrase I am on its own was understood to be a statement of divinity. The I am means God. There's no question about that. You want to look in the New Testament, in John chapter 8, in verse 58, Jesus said, before Abraham was born, I am. And the people were going to stone him to death as a blasphemer because they understood that he was claiming to be God. There was no question that Jesus was claiming to be God. He said, I am. Well, only God says, I am like that. So they were going to kill him as a blasphemer. This name here in Exodus and this whole scene stressed the permanence and the persistence of God. I wanted to get more P words. Subsistence would probably be a better word than persistence. Now you might wonder what God's nature is like. We all wonder what God is like. What's his nature like? Well, here he tells us, I am. That means he is. He exists. He is. And he always has done. Existence, subsistence, persistence, permanence. They're core to who God is. You never change, like we say. He is self-existent. The only thing in all creation that exists because of itself. You know, I don't know if you've ever asked this on camp. I'm trying to remember. Maybe you asked it when you were younger. Who made God? It's a classic question kids ask. No one made God. He exists of himself. He didn't create himself. He's uncreated. The uncreated one. It's a really good choice of song. He always has been. He's like nothing else in all the universe. He is the foundation on which all reality is built. Now, moreover, through this scene and through the declaration that he made, we see that his existence isn't a passive or a blunt thing. I mean, there's stuff that exists and is solid. Rocks exist and are solid. Mountains, we've got a great view of mountains. I'm just going to distract you, those of you who can see them. Mountains exist, they're solid, they seem permanent and unchanging, but Their existence is kind of blunt. They're just there. They don't do anything. It's like a brute fact of the way things are. But God's existence, his permanence, is a living, active, burning thing. Now, what better picture do we have for this than the burning bush? Now, though the bush, verse 2, though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. It was just blazing away without being consumed. Now, God's permanence, his unchanging, self-existent nature, therefore, is not stagnation. Like, you know, when a puddle of water has been there a while, that's not nice water, is it? It's been around a while and it's just kind of gross and it's there and there's a film of scum on the water. That's not what God's permanence is like. It is passionate. It is vibrant. It's like a burning bush that doesn't burn away. Yahweh, therefore, is a name stressing to us how God undergirds everything that is. Because he is existence. It's his nature. Because he is, reality can be. That is permanence. Let's move on. Our third perspective. We've already started to get hints of this. It's power. So proviso, permanence, power. A great power is displayed in the burning bush, isn't it? A bush that is on fire, that doesn't burn up, is not normal. I mean, you can set a bush on fire. Please don't set a bush on fire. But if you did, hypothetically, let's keep this hypothetical, you would feel the heat radiating out from it. You would feel the power of combustion or whatever chemical effect it is that radiates then heat. It's a chemical reaction, isn't it? There's a burning that throws out power. So if something is burning and yet it's burning without being consumed, that's displaying even more power. It goes against everything we expect. It is not normal. It's no wonder Moses he sort of catches a glimpse of it and he goes over to take a look. He's like, oh, I'm never going to see this again. It's a mighty, miraculous thing. He's not just like, oh, there's a forest fire, I better move the sheep round to the other side of the mountain. He sees there's something powerful happening here and he wants to get a glimpse of it. I want you to notice as well the context to this whole scene. What's the setting here? Well, Moses, as we saw it, he's going to be sent back to Egypt. He came from Egypt. He was raised in Pharaoh's household. He got a great education, and then he murdered a guy trying to help the Israelites out, and then he ran away into the desert, which is where we find him decades later. He's been sent back to Egypt, not just to sort of settle down and have it easy, but he's meant to stand in front of the most powerful man in the world, Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, and he is to demand, he's not meant to ask nicely, he is to demand that Pharaoh let all his slaves go. All his Hebrew slaves, all the Israelite people he's got working for him. He's asking Pharaoh, the most important man in the world, to shoot his own economy in the foot. He's like, I want you to declare a recession and ruin your labor force. And here Moses has no leverage other than the say-so of the slave's own God. And that, after all, you might think, well, if he was such a powerful God, they wouldn't be slaves, would they? But what's Pharaoh going to do? He's going to turn him out, isn't he? He's not going to listen to Moses. And yet Yahweh declares how his power will be displayed in Egypt. His mighty hand, verse 20, it's a bit later than our reading, will strike the Egyptians with all the wonders that he will perform among them. This hand, by the way, has such strength that he will carry the whole people out of Egypt. He's not just going to get a few scrapings. The whole people of Israel, old people, young people, even with the livestock, he's going to carry them out of Egypt and he's going to place them comfortably in Canaan. This God has power to save like nothing else. The perspective number 4, we've seen, I'm going to forget these eventually. Proviso, permanence, power, now provision. Yahweh means provision. Now we see here that God's power is not a fearsome but purposeless power. Because, like that bush that you hypothetically set on fire and it just burns away and you've not achieved anything except maybe warming your hands a bit. There are things that have power. Things out there in the world and the universe that have power. A volcano has power. Have you ever been near a volcano? It's like this menacing thing just waiting to explode. It's got power. A supernova has power. That's the kind of power we can't imagine. What about people? There are people with political power. Vladimir Putin has power. But that power it's like the volcano. It's a power to explode, a power to destroy. God's power is not like that. It is exercised in provision, in providing. He will give the Israelites a land of their own, and not just any land, a good and spacious land in verse 8, a land flowing with milk and honey. That's not literal, it's saying it's a really good land. It's fertile, there's lots of food to be had. You don't even need to work for it, it's just there to take. And God won't just provide them with a bare minimum. That's what we get with this idea of milk and honey. He's going to send them out of Egypt with riches. They're going to be loaded with gold. They're going to plunder the Egyptians, we read in verse 12. Now we all need to understand this. This wasn't just for the Israelites. We all need to understand this about God's provision. He is not stingy. Some of us complain that our mum and dads maybe don't give us enough pocket money because they feel a bit stingy. I was like that. We always go in. God is not stingy. He's not tight-fisted. God is lavish with his children. Jesus taught us the same thing. In Matthew 7, verse 11, he says, if you then, talking to people, though you're evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, and probably your mums and dads do give you nice things. And they do give good gifts. If we, being sinful people, know how to give good gifts to our children, and we do, it doesn't mean that we're horrible all the time. It just means we're not God. If we, being evil, know how to give good gifts to our children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good gifts to those who ask him? How much more? More than we can imagine. Now, it's true, I'm going to disappoint you. God might not give us every little thing that we want. Now, you might not get that sports car or that Tesla. You don't need a private jet. I mean, where would you park it? Maybe we can all do with, downgrading. We can use the own brand cereal. That's fine. We don't need to spend excess money on it. And when we say that, it sounds a bit in comparison like it's a bit miserly of God that he only gives us what we need. It's like when our mums and dads give us what we need, but not what we want. It still feels a bit tight, doesn't it? It's like, well, I'll give you a bit of pocket money. That's enough. You don't need more. It's like, well, I could definitely use more. But think about the bounty that God has of what we need. What do we need? We need grace. We're sinners and we need grace. We need mercy. We need love. We all need love. We need our sins forgiven. We need it dealt with. We need community. We need to be with other people that we know and trust and we know love us. These are the gifts that God gives. These are the gifts God has promised to give. And he doesn't just measure out the tiniest, measly little amount with which we can make do and mend. He's not like, all right, you need community, I'm going to send you a little bit. You need love, I'm going to send you a little bit. You need some grace, I'm going to like pouring out of a pepper grinder or something. I'll put a little bit of grace on you. Now, God is generous beyond belief. His grace is extravagant. He pours out mercy beyond what we could ever use. God's grace isn't just enough to make up the difference. It is so much we could drown in the ocean of God's love. Yahweh means provision. Here we are, number 5. Can anyone remember number 1? Proviso. Number 2, permanence. Number 3, Power. Number 4, provision. Number 5, promise. Hopefully you're writing these down, because as I move my notes over, I can't see what the first few are. I've got to remember them. So we're going to have a little audience interaction. The name Yahweh, we find, is deeply significant in terms of covenant. Covenant's a really important idea in the Bible, and I'll explain it to you. A covenant is a bit like a contract. It's an arrangement between God and man, or mankind, or people, by which mankind or people will be blessed. Now, think about that. Did you notice what I just said? It's an arrangement between God and us. Let's say that. Between God and us, by which we will be blessed. The covenant between God and man is not equal. God is categorically higher and holier and mightier than mankind. We've already seen that in the first few talks. He's other. He's amazing. He's incredible. And we have nothing he needs. We don't have anything. Who's ever given to God? Who's ever made a debtor of God? We can't give him stuff that he's like, oh, I really need, I could do with that. I'm going to come up short without that. It's not like that. And yet in covenant, God ties himself to a people, and he makes promise after promise of what he will do for them. He makes these great and mighty promises, and he signs the contract with his name. Now, in doing so, he's inviting the people to hold him to his promise. It's like he's voluntarily putting himself in a bind. Think about what I said yesterday morning about how the pagan peoples viewed name. They thought if something gives us its name, we've got power over it, and we can control it. And he says, you know, I'm going to give you my name, and I'm going to give you a contract that I have signed, and you can hold me to it. And he says to Moses, here's my name. And he tells him to call him by this name. God is saying, here's the number to ring up when you don't see these promises. Here's the helpline. Here's my direct line. Here's the password to the account. It's like he's giving us leverage on him. Yahweh means promise. And number 6. Shall we go through again? Number 1, proviso. Number 2, permanence. Number 3, number 4. Number 5, number 6, I'm not going to ask you to guess it, is presence. The 6th perspective is presence. Like presents with a C at the end, not presents. Not like Christmas presents, but like presents, like someone being near you. Because this ties right into the promise and the fact that in covenant, God binds his people to him, but that then means that he binds himself to his people. It's like he says, I will make you my people, like he's bringing them into his family and saying, you'll be my people, but that means he's their people, he's their person. He is their God. And he promises in covenant to be with them. He says, verse 12, I will be with you. And he's not saying that in a kind of vague, like, oh, I'll be thinking of you. Thoughts and prayer. Thoughts and prayer. He says, I'll be with you, as in, I'm going to be right next to you. I'm going to be holding your hand. When you stumble, I'm going to be there to pick you up. I'm going to be in the room with you. Right there on Horeb, the mountain of God, Yahweh appeared to Moses. Now, if we're familiar with this story, we might forget about how incredible, how weird this is. Now, bear with me a second, because some of you, rightly, if you were paying attention, might want to point out the fact that in verse 2, it says, the angel of Yahweh appeared to Moses. And it might even say in your Bible, a messenger. So you're thinking it's a messenger of God. Some translations do put that. Or perhaps you're thinking would this be like a pre-incarnate appearance of the Lord Jesus? Is this what we call a Christophany or a Christophany? That means a visible appearance of Jesus before he came as Jesus, or the visible appearance of the Son of God, I should say, the second person of the Trinity. Or is it just an angel, something, with wings or 7 wings or eyes all over it, or all the other weird stuff that angels seem to have when they appear in the Old Testament? The reality is that in the Old Testament, especially in the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, An angel of God is often not meant to be understood as a separate entity from God, although sometimes they are. It's a separate spiritual being from God. But sometimes, or perhaps more often, it's meant as a manifestation of God. Now Moses is told, verse 5, take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. It's not holy ground because there's an angel there. He's not in the presence of a holy angel. He's told because he's in the presence of Yahweh Elohim. Now Moses, when he looks away in verse 6, he doesn't just look away when he's in the presence of an angel. That happens plenty in the Bible. It's one of the first things angels say when they turn up, isn't it? Fear not. It's like, you're pretty scary. They say, fear not, because I'm terrifying. I get that. Don't be afraid. I've got good news. Moses doesn't look away in that because he's afraid of the angel. If you read it, it says he looks away because he's afraid to see Elohim. He's afraid to see God. Now the name Yahweh will forever be tied to God being present with his people. He's tied to them by the covenant he initiated. Presence. I mean, that's what the whole book of Exodus is about. God's people with their God. Perspective number 7. Let's go through it again. Come on. You can shout if you want. Maybe not too loud. It's a small room. Number 1, proviso. Number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5, number 6, and number 7 is personal. Think of what I've just been talking about, that terror of the holy. The almighty fear Moses must have had, a fear of teetering on the edge of destruction. You can imagine kind of fear that I hope none of you have ever had. Like the fear where you've stepped out into the road and you notice there's a lorry coming right for you. The fear if you're out in the jungle and you hear the crack of a twig and you look around and there's maybe not a lion, they don't live in the jungle, but there's a tiger there and it's bearing down on you. The fear and you're on the side of a volcano and you see a little vent open up and lava starts to come out and you think, there's no way I can get down before this takes me out. That's fear, but that is not the fear like the fear of the holy, the fear of coming face to face with your Creator. God is present in this incident. When Moses, a murderer and a coward, is stood. A sinful man. A better man than many of us, yes? But imperfect man. And yet, this sinful man is given a name to use by this God, and it's a name that is personal. It's an invitation, like we saw yesterday, to a relationship. And it's not the relationship of judge to the person about to be executed. The relationship, as you see through Exodus, of a friend. Moses, he has to make some concessions, you notice that, to God's holiness, to his otherness. He's not to treat God like his pal, like they're buddies. He's to acknowledge God's separateness. He takes his sandals off. There's got to be some kind of approach made. There's got to be some taking off of something, some putting on of something if you're going to come into the presence of God. But notice this, he's not excluded. Maybe you think that's a bit weird because you're sick of taking off your own shoes when you're coming in and out of the room. You think, I don't like it. Or if you went into a church building maybe, or a temple somewhere around the world, and you had to take your shoes off, it's a bit annoying. But it's not that bad a concession to make if you were to come into the presence of God, and he's not excluded. You can come into God's presence. It's not like, well, I'm going to put a wall up so you can't get in. This is a God who is to be known. His name is given, and he states, and I've read it a couple of times already, this is my name forever. The name you shall call me from generation to generation. Now, you take a note of this. You don't have to turn to it. You can compare this with Exodus 6, verse 3. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as God Almighty, El Shaddai. We'll see that later in the week. But by my name Yahweh, I did not make myself fully known to them. Now, that sounds like this is the first time anyone's ever called by this name. That's not quite true. We know people knew before Exodus 3 that God was called Yahweh. You could compare 6:20. So it's even in chapter 6. Again, Moses' own mother, that's some great Bible trivia. You can impress people. Does anyone know what Moses' mother was called? Oh, I'll put you out of misery. It's Jochebed or Jochebed. It means Yahweh is glory. So, with Elohim, if someone's got El in their name like Elijah, that means God is something, or God is my something. If someone's got Yah, like Joshua, or something like Elijah, if they've got Yah in their name, it's a reference to this name. And Moses' own mother had that Yah sound in her name. So people knew that God of Israel was called Yahweh long before this. But there was still a distance between them. They hadn't been asked to use this name in the same way as God initiates here. Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, they'd all dealt with this same God. He was this same Elohim. They'd all been in covenant with him. But they were to deal with him as Elohim, or El Shaddai, like we're going to see. And it's wonderful. It's incredible, like we saw. But there's still a gap between them that God is now bridging. He's putting a ladder up. So I'll put it this way. They knew Yahweh was God's name. But they didn't use it because they were still calling him God. This is a bit like me calling my teacher Mr. Smith. Because I wasn't yet old enough or on intimate enough terms with him to call him Josh. Even if I knew that was what he was called. Because a lot of you might have teachers and you know what they're called, even if you call them Mr. So-and-so or Miss So-and-so. Now, hopefully not Miss So-and-so. That's even more disrespectful, isn't it? But when I was invited to call my teacher by his first name, it was a sign that I was being drawn into a different relationship. It wasn't going to be the same as it was when he was Mr. Smith. It's a relationship that is less formal, perhaps, or it's closer with a teacher. It's more as friends or peers than pupil. It's a suggestion you're like, well, call me by my first name. We're going to learn from each other. I'm not just going to teach you. Maybe you'll teach me. It's an invitation at school to challenge their statements, to grow with them. Now, obviously, God's giving of his personal name is not an invitation to view ourselves as peers or equals. Because hopefully you pick up from all these different P words that that's not true, is it? But what it is an invitation to a personal relationship. The way you have a personal relationship with your parents, with your family. Like knowing your parents by their first name. Being treated like you're mature. You're their friend. Yahweh gives us his name because he intends it to be used. He invites us into a personal relationship with him, a covenantal relationship with him. We can enjoy his presence, his promise, his provision, and his power, all assured by the permanence with which he underlines his name. He is. Do you know that? Do you know the way into the holy place? Do you understand that we, all of us, if we want it, have access through Jesus Christ? That's kind of the equivalent of Moses taking off his sandals they brought. We put on Jesus and we can go in. This God who invites us to speak to him, to be friends with him, who will never let his people down. Or are you still calling him Mr. God?